Sixth graders were doing a joint science fair, joint project with science and social studies, where they're working together to colonize, establish a colony on Mars. Unfortunately, they were supposed to watch the SpaceX launch yesterday, but that was canceled. It's rescheduled for Saturday, and we plan on watching that with them on Saturday. There was a lot of preparation that was necessary to allow us to continue to do standardized testing, which allows us as a school to measure students' academic process, but it also allows teachers to make vital instructional decisions going forward. And it took a lot of time, and it took a group effort to make sure that happened. Proud to announce that Mr. Mahoney's efforts in the Cambodian summer camp that he developed a few years ago will continue. I will continue to work alongside him, and we will do that on a virtual platform. All students who are not involved in the summer reading camp will be able to meet weekly to have our first virtual book club. We understand that despite all our efforts to maintain this sense of normalcy for students, their life has been anything but normal. And Mr. Cox has worked with sixth graders in ELA to kind of capture students' emotions and their experience in a poem, which we have Lorenzo in the meet, and he'll share that poem with you guys.
Go ahead and come off mute, Lorenzo. Thank you. Uh-oh, what happened to your sound again, Lorenzo? Try it one more time.
What we miss in quarantine.
You know what? You sound like you're far away in a tunnel. Like you're far away in a tunnel. Oh, okay. If the sound isn't going to cooperate, I will send out the poem after to everyone so you can hear it and read it. And it's actually a really good depiction of the things that the small things we don't think about that the kids are missing right now, even though we do our best to try to fill some of those gaps. But I'm sorry the sound isn't working, Lorenzo. We'll have your big moment again soon. Maybe we'll include you in the spring event video, okay? Thank you. All right. Kamari, would you like to go ahead and introduce our speaker?
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Wisdom Powell is the Director of Health Disparities Institute and Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Connecticut. Formerly, Dr. Powell spent over a decade at UNC Chapel Hill's Gilling School of Global Public Health, where she held a tenured appointment in the Department of Health Behavior and was Research Associate Professor and Associate Director of the Center for Health Equity Research in the Department of Social Medicine. In 2011, she was appointed by President Obama to serve as White House Fellow to Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. She has published numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, including ones in the American Journal of Public Health, Journal of General Internal Medicine, Behavioral Medicine, and Child Development. In addition to being a White House Fellow, she is an American Psychological Associate, APA, minority, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Kaiser Permanente, Birch Leadership, Institute of African American Research, and Ford Foundation Fellow, who received a PhD and MS in clinical psychology and MPH from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She serves as chair of the APA's work group on health disparities in boys and men and co-chair of the Health Committee for President Obama's My Brother's Keeper initiative in Durham County. Most recently, she was appointed by Hartford, Connecticut Mayor Luke Bronin to serve as chair of the Public Health Committee for the Hartford COVID-19 Recovery Working Group. We are pleased to have to have her with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Wisdom Powell.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Kamari, and for reading my bio, and also to all of you for the opportunity to be before you. But I'd like to especially thank Ms. Glenn for the invitation to be with you this morning. I'm going to share my screen so that you can follow along with my remarks this morning. So I'm going to be talking to you this morning about optimizing supports for boys and their families amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. I always like to start these conversations by level setting with some data. As we are all aware, COVID-19 has descended upon our nation and laid bare some of the most pressing and entrenched disparities related to healthcare and health outcomes. We know, for example, that COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact on minority communities, especially on the children that are embedded in those communities. And we know that these data represent not a biological or genetic phenomena, but are likely the consequence of limited access to resources in the places where people live, grow, work, play, get educated, and get health care. But while we're talking about COVID-19 disparities, it's important to level set, to lift up the fact that these disparities have pressing consequences for all of us. And in fact, we know that health disparities, when they're present, have direct cost on healthcare spending and indirect cost on worker productivity and income. Also, we know that over time, health disparities that go unresolved have a negative impact on our capacity to compete in the global economic marketplace. We also know that the disparities that we are observing in COVID-19 that are disproportionately impacting communities of color result in higher rates of death by COVID-19. And these deaths are likely also the consequence of the fact that many people who reside in communities of color are likely to live in viral hotspots, are likely to face higher rates of employment loss in the face of COVID-19. And we know that diverse families have within them a higher number of quote unquote essential workers, which means they are putting themselves daily in the vortex, the eye of the storm, in order to provide for their families. We know that while we're talking about the health, the physical health impacts, that COVID-19 has many residual psychosocial impacts, resulting sometimes in feelings of social isolation, depression, substance use and misuse and addiction, more relationship and family conflicts, generalized anxiety, and trauma, which will be the focus of my remarks this morning. I want to remind us that many of our colleagues in the field of psychology and psychiatry have been the canaries in the mine, reminding us that the COVID-19 crisis is also in of itself a trauma pandemic in the making, and that we would do ourselves better if we were to prepare for the psychological impact of a crisis like this, particularly on our children. I think that when we're talking about trauma, it's important to define it because we talk about trauma in very different ways. We talk about trauma as a clinical diagnosis, one that is outlined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but we also talk about trauma as an injury or a wound. And we think that it's important to lift these two differences up because there are often children and families who won't rise to, whose symptomatology won't rise to the point of clinical significance, but who may be walking around with undetected, undertreated trauma symptomatology. Often in our lexicon these days, we're talking about trauma in children as adverse childhood experiences or ACEs. And it's a term that we use to describe all types of abuse, neglect, and other potentially traumatic experiences that can occur to people under the ages of 18. A lot of data has been accumulated to affirm that ACEs have implications for long-term outcomes, like they can increase risky health behaviors, chronic conditions, and also lead to low life, sort of exacerbation of a sense of low life potential and early death. In our nation, we have observed differences by race, ethnicity in the experiences of multiple ACEs. So In other words, when we look at the data, we see that American Indian and African American children are more likely to experience 2 or more adverse experiences. And what that means is that they're showing up with more compounded or complex kinds of traumas. But just so we're aware that the impacts of trauma, reach beyond sort of the emotional consequences, it also can impact the physiologic or biophysiologic regulation of children, so that children who are traumatized can show up with more impaired immune systems. They can have alterations in their genetic blueprint and enhance chronic disease risk over their life course. So intervening early is critical to life course optimal development. In other words, ACEs and traumatic events like COVID-19 can inflict visible and invisible wounds to the bodies, minds, and spirits of our precious children. Not to mention that trauma can have implications for learning and academic performance, like disruptions in the ability to learn, retrieve, and process verbal information, difficulties organizing material sequentially, which can lead to difficulty in reading, writing, and communication. And we know that when children are traumatized and they show up in our classrooms, they're more easily distracted. They have more difficult time focusing and concentrating, and have challenges sometimes with goal setting and planning. But while we're talking about trauma, it's also important to lift up that there are gender differences in the ways that our children respond to trauma. So among boys, for example, we know that there is more of a tendency to fight or flight in the face of trauma, and that our children, our male children, are more inclined to rely on problem-focused coping and to withdraw from social supports as opposed to leaning into them when they're faced with trauma. And that's because we also know that there are differences in the types of arousal systems that are activated in the face of trauma, so that we see sometimes in boys when they are experiencing trauma or trauma symptoms, more irritability, more angry outbursts, and more impulsivity. We also know that because boys are socialized to think about their emotions in different ways, that they're subject to the set of shared cultural expectations or standards about how they should behave. And these are rooted not in their biology or personality characteristics, but rooted in sort of social messaging and standards that we set. So we give messages to boys like, boys don't cry, walk it off, take it like a man. And those kinds of norms and values can sometimes lead boys to silence or suppress their pain. And so because this pressure to be a man about it, so-called man about it, when responding to stress is so permanent in our context, we see that the more rigidly men and boys hold to those ideas, the more likely they are to have more detrimental health outcomes. So even as we're talking about sort of the capacity of our boys and how norms can impact their trauma reporting, it's important to note that there are also significant systems level gaps in our capacity to listen and respond to the unique distress signals that boys send us. So they're talking, but we're not always listening. We also tend to adultify our children in ways that lead them to be viewed as less innocent and more adult-like. We refer to this in our work as adultification biases. And we know that from numerous studies, when we look at boys of color and girls of color in classrooms and in our neighborhoods, and actually in our society, they're often viewed as more adult than their non-Hispanic white peers. And so they are often faced with harsher treatment and higher standards and biases around what they should be able to do in the face of trauma. So in fact, we expect sometimes for boys, particularly racial and ethnic minority boys, to leap over structural disadvantage and systematic dehumanization in a single bound. But our children are wonderful, marvelous, wonders to behold, but they are not superheroes. And one of the most haunting documentaries that I've watched probably in my lifetime is Ava DuVernay's documentary, When They See Us, and the motivation for the title of today's remarks. And in this documentary, one of the characters who plays Ray Santana says something really poignant. He said, they say boys will be boys, but they're not talking about us. They don't mean us, they mean other boys. And I think that this quote illustrates exactly what I'm trying to convey about the power and impact of adultification biases on our capacity to listen, hear, and respond to our boys. And we know that there's a difficulty in our capacity to listen and respond, because men in our country and boys have some of the highest rates of suicide completion. And that's despite reporting lower depressive symptoms. What that says to me is that boys are having and men are having a more difficult time, perhaps, conveying what they're feeling. And when they do, we don't necessarily respond affirmatively. And this is showing up in data, recent data, indicating an uptick in suicide among Black boys. And, whenever I show data points about suicide in our children, I always like to put up the faces of actual children who have suffered as a consequence, because it's easy to get desensitized to the experiences of our boys by presenting statistics. So here are the faces of 3 young, thriving, beautiful Black children who recently perished as a consequence of suicide. And I hope that we keep them in the forefronts of our imagination as we think about how we coordinate investments, how we redirect resources, and more importantly, how we build wraparound supports for our children in schools. And while we're talking about stress, trauma, exposure, and potential fallout from COVID-19, we have to also think about the fact that many of the boys that we serve at DNS, face unique racialized stress that can also compromise their socio-emotional well-being and increase risk for trauma. There is a lot of data to suggest that there's a persistence of racism in our society, despite our well-intentions and despite our motivations to form a more unified democracy. The American Psychological Association published a report not too long ago that said that, nearly half of US adults report that they've experienced some form of unfair treatment or discrimination, including being unfairly questioned or threatened by police. I lift that up this morning because we know that there are systems of higher surveillance that occur among young Black and Latinx and Hispanic males as they try to navigate social space. And some of that data has borne out in higher rates of stop and frisks, for example, in most of our urban centers. But we also know that the structural racism we're talking about, not the racism that can exist as a consequence of interpersonal interactions, but the structural racism that I'm describing has life course implications for the upward social mobility of Black boys. And we've seen this play out in data that was reported in the New York Times, I think a couple of years ago. But there are also fatal consequences for the exposure to racism over time that, again, our boys are observing in their everyday lives. And even data from Harvard suggests that over the past 50 years, there's a disproportionate risk among Black males in certain communities of being killed by police. I would be remiss this morning if I didn't lift up the names of our most recent, fallen citizens as a consequence of some of this quote unquote racialized violence. But what I want to lift up here, not to be somber or dramatic, but to remind us that during the pandemic, that while sheltering in place, our children are bearing virtual witness to these events, and that this repeated exposure can contribute to what we call vicarious trauma. So it's a kind of trauma that you can experience just by bearing witness. Like, it doesn't have to happen to you, it happens to someone that you love or someone that you're connected to. And this can have subsequent impacts on learning and academic performance. But we've been talking a lot in our field about trauma-informed approaches. So I want to sort of acknowledge that we do have tools in our toolkit to address these things, right? To recognize that our boys are valuable, wonders to behold, worthy of protection and cover. And that trauma-informed approaches actually are the first step, right, in realizing and sort of acknowledging the widespread impact of trauma and its potential paths for recovery. But I'm of the mindset that trauma-informed approaches is just what, as I mentioned, a first step. And what we should really be moving towards are more healing-centered approaches. In my opinion, a healing-centered approach is one that, involves us paying attention to the whole child, the whole community that the child is embedded in, and approaching trauma not simply as an isolated experience, but rather highlighting the ways that in which trauma and healing are experienced collectively, such as in the cases that we're witnessing, more recently. But more importantly, healing-centered approaches can help boys discover that they are much more than the sum total of their traumas. And so we have been working to promote this idea that we can leverage healing-centered strategies in schools, in our communities, and in our families for boys and men of color by focusing on meeting those unmet social determinants of health needs. And when we talk about social determinants of health, we're talking about those resources and places where people live, work, grow, play, pray, and get educated. And we're talking about, the neighborhood and the built environment and issues around economic viability for families. And we're in the state of Connecticut, we are actively working to create healing-centered, multi-sectoral alliances and partnerships where we are aligning strategies to amplify our collective impact. We're leveraging and coordinating investments, incubating and accelerating rapid cycle innovations, and more importantly, enhancing youth-led and community-led health policy actions so that we're not doing something about our children without them. We also are, creating healing-centered communities by bringing them together around art. We've leveraged an entire arts-based strategy around visualizing health equity for boys and men of color so that we can truly see them in their fullest humanity. We're building on the National Academy of Science and Medicine's Visualizing Health Equity project, and we are creating opportunities for community to come together and talk about difficult topics, but leading with art so that we are touching people in their heart space rather than just purely in their head space. We are also taking this work to schools and developing arts-based health equity curriculums that allow boys to express themselves and to see images of themselves in a positive light. We found that our boys in our local schools are deeply engaged in these kinds of activities and are hungry for opportunities to express themselves, just like our young colleague this morning was hungry to share his poem with us. We also know that we need to create spaces for trauma healing and recovery. And I have moved away from simply talking about erecting safe spaces, because safe spaces are important. But what's more imaginative to me is a brave space, a space where youth can show up and have their voices amplified. And more importantly, where intergenerational exchange can happen. So we've been holding intergenerational fishbowl dialogues where youth and elders come together to talk about issues in their community, particularly around trauma, healing, and recovery. But youth are telling us that they are here and they want to be heard. They want to be trusted. They want to be able to approach their elders. And they want us to understand that sometimes things happen to them that they don't expect, like the COVID-19 pandemic, and they're forced to react. But what we can do to optimize the supports for boys and their families amidst the COVID-19 pandemic is really simple. And I hearken back to a set of advice that I received from my early supervisor as I was training as a trauma psychologist. And I was struggling with trying to get a young male in my practice to open up and talk. We would have sessions where he would sit in silence for the entire session. And I'm talking several. And my supervisor remarked that he's speaking. You just have to listen. And in fact, rise above the silence and speak to the wounds. So if I were to leave you with anything this morning that I wanted as a takeaway, it would be that. And to speak to the wounds means to hold space for boys, for emotional expression. But as adults with more power, privilege, and opportunity, we should also be working actively and to dismantle systems of dehumanization that invisibilize our boys. We should express our value, the values that we see in our boys, by displaying radical empathy, radical hope, and what my mother would refer to as agape love. I would like to thank you all for listening this morning, and especially Ms. Glenn for inviting me. I know she's going to lead us through a brief Q&A, which I'm pleased to be a part of and to entertain your questions. I know this has been a rapid fire conversation, but I also want to leave you with my contact information for follow-up. I'm principally at the Health Disparities Institute at UConn Health, but I also have a consulting firm called the Evidence Watch Collective, where we sort of work with schools and provide much more professional development support for educators, school resource officers, et cetera. But more importantly, I just want to thank you for your attention this morning and for your dedication and commitment to our boys.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. I want everyone to give you a virtual round of applause. Thank you for providing a lot of information in a very succinct, short period of time. I'd like our school social worker, before we open up for Q&A, to say a couple of words. One of the things that I've noticed since this whole pandemic started is that the fact that Durham Nativity School is much more than just a school and just educating young men has come to the forefront a lot during this pandemic, and we've had opportunities to highlight those other parts of our work. And Miss Allen Albright has been doing a lot with our family. So could you say a few words? Come off mute, Brittany.
Yes, I'm here.
All right, go ahead.
First of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Dr. Powell. For me as a clinical social worker, this was kind of just a wonderful refresher and reminder that these are the areas that I should focus on, that I should reinforce, and really the reason why I feel that Durham Nativity brought me in as a clinical social worker. And so particularly when it comes to the structural racism and, you know, the health disparities and racial disparities that our boys and our families are up against, sometimes they're not discussed. And even though we are aware of them, sometimes if you don't speak their name and speak of what they are, we can let them go by without addressing it. So thank you so much. From my standpoint, kind of echoing what Mr. Glenn said, because Durham Nativity kind of did a great job tackling the issue of COVID up front, I was able to plan ahead before the boys were dismissed from the physical building. And so I was able to speak with the families ahead of time and kind of assess needs. So throughout these last several weeks, we have been able to provide support for families based on their need. And so with the incoming donations and funding, we've sent out several gift cards for Food Lion. And so they've been receiving support for food, for groceries. And several of our families have also received utility support and rent support just as much as we can. And I would say that's about 85% of our families that have been supported at this point. So we are really, really pleased with where things stand right now, and we're going to continue to do it over the summer. And from my standpoint, I've been trying to meet with the students one-on-one, and as Mr. Glenn mentioned, they're going to be in summer camp, and so that is definitely going to allow me to continue having one-on-one sessions via Zoom, kind of therapeutically as well. So that's where we stand from the social work aspect of things.
Great, thank you, Ms. Allen Albright. Ruby, do you want to just come off of mute and just ask your question live?
Yes.
Okay.
I can. Hi, everybody. My question is, as a parent of a African American young man or grandparent, how do we empower our sons to share their feelings when we're telling them? And I think you spoke about it in your presentation. When we're telling them to be a man, to be strong, to don't stop crying, those kinds of things. How do we empower them?
So I love the question, and I will say that, we've all been quote unquote guilty of saying the very things that I lifted up this morning as being somewhat more problematic. So we should all just give ourselves a break, because we all sort of breathe in those same norms too, and we've all been socialized to think about our boys in this way. And so the first thing I would offer is that we need to stop referring to our young boys as little men and as young men, because they're not men, actually, they're boys, they're still developing. And while it's a subtle, sort of difference, and it also implies something about our expectations for them. So the first thing we can do is reimagine boyhood and allow our boys to be boys. And secondly, provide them with opportunities to express themselves that are not necessarily always verbal opportunities, because sometimes finding the words, we know that boys have a more difficult time accessing language around emotions, like the differences in being able to, their capacity to determine the difference between sort of shame and anger, for example, are not quite as developed or intact at this age. And so we can help them by giving them language to talk about their emotions, but also opportunities like through artistic expression, through writing, as we displayed this morning with poetry, through the arts. I can say, personally myself, that the arts saved my life. So it's part of why I'm so passionate about the integration of them into our pedagogy. But more importantly, we can listen to them and be patient and recognize that our children are containers for a lot of the emotional distress that families experience. What has been interesting to me, and I'm sure Ms. Albright can attest, is that when you see a family that comes in for therapy, for family therapy, it's usually the children are expressing, what the adults are experiencing, right? Like they are coming in, we're treating the child, but really it's the family that's in turmoil. So I just think we have to hold space for them and really recognize that they are growing, thriving children who are worthy of protection.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll open the floor now for other questions. You can, and if you don't want to say it out loud, you can put it in the chat and I'll read it for you. You can just unmute yourself and ask a question. So, questions.
Hey, how you doing? Mike Glenn again. We at Durham Nativity School, we always like to think of ourselves as not just a school, but a DNS community. What resources or community agencies have you found best work with kind of with being able to help students with being able to understand those language and express themselves and provide them with the necessary tools to kind of deal with being a minority male?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Glenn. There are, a plethora of resources available at the American Psychological Association and through the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, those two and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And I will enumerate these resources for this illustrious body of colleagues and committed community members, and I will ensure that Ms. Glenn has those to circulate, both links to those resources as well. But I'm currently serving as president of the American Psychological's Division on Men and Masculinities, and we are putting together resources specifically for boys and families caring for boys to provide just the kind of advice and supports that you're lifting up, and also that Ms. Tompkins lifted up also. So we will certainly ensure that those resources get to DNS so that you can leverage them in your efforts to serve the boys and their families.
Other questions?
Ms. Glenn, this is Sue. I do have a question.
Okay.
As someone who is not a member of a minority population, but wants to be and has certainly attempted to be supportive of everything that DNS is doing, do you have particular strategies that you can suggest to those of us who can't identify in the same way that members of a minority community can with the DNS students?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Thank you so much for asking it, because it's the sort of proverbial elephant in the room. Like, how do we really form, allyship in a way that leverages all that we can individually bring? I mean, I recognize this challenge, especially because for the last 20 years, I've worked in the field of men's health and the health of boys and men, and I'm a woman. And so walking into those spaces, it's really clear, that I am not there to be charitable, in a sense, that the way to work as an ally is to show up and recognize that my liberation is bound up in the liberation of the very people that I serve. And I think when we get that at the root, then our intentions flow and the actions flow from that. But more importantly, we all have privilege, right? I grew up very humbly, but I recognize that I've now entered a space where I have more privilege than what I grew up with. And how I leverage that is important. So when I'm in rooms such as this, I have a responsibility to talk about some of the tough issues, because I know that if I don't lift them up, they won't be lifted up. And as an ally, I think that's another way that you can use your voice and your privilege is to call attention to the elephants in the room and be courageous in our attempts to engage those conversations. But also, most of us sit in positions where we have some decision-making authority, like we even by small measure. And I often say that one of the things I do when I enter a room, when I know that my privilege is operating, is that I look around and see who's at the table and I wonder who's not here, and I ask pointed questions about why they're not at this table and why their voices aren't being centered. These are challenging times we're in, and I always believe that we are all striving and trying to do our best here. And my sense about this is that when you express a true desire to, as you have just being in this community, that people will rise up to meet you at your highest intention, right? Communities will rise up to meet you there. And, you know, this is tough work. This is work that generational, work, but we're here. And I believe strongly that there's a possibility for us to end even the structural racism that we see. And what I like to say to folks is that, we are a really, accomplished nation. We have mapped the human genome. We have sent, men to space. We have figured out complex algorithms to connect people in social space, across miles. We can solve the problem of racism. I'm a radical optimist. I believe we can do it. And the fact that people are showing up in this space and caring for this community in the way that you are gives me even more hope.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Go ahead, Mr. Jefferson.
Dr. Brown. The dog is talking. He's happy to see Angela walking. But Dr. Brown and I, we're from the same neighborhoods. We're from Norfolk, Virginia, and we kind of live some of the same experiences. And just before this call, I was kind of looking at the news, and it kind of put me in a bad space about the things that have happened lately, and they keep getting ignored. And everyone wants a safe space to talk about things like that. And but if you can't get grown folks in the room and to be able to talk about things like that and discuss your feelings, the same thing we're trying to tell the kids, like, we're trying to get the kids and we're gonna get them a safe space. We can't even do a safe space with grown-ups sometimes. So what I was thinking just to myself, I'm like, well, how if we as grown-ups can, I talked to Dan one day, Dan Benelli. I said, Dan, go check out When They See Us. He said, oh man, I can't do that. I can't do that. He said, it hurts me too bad. And I get that. I really do get that. But if we can't, as adults, be able to come to a common ground, how are we going to share with the kids how to heal from situations like this? So how do we best move forward with the kids? How do we help them through this? If I know I'm having a tough time, how am I able to help the kids in our community get through this too?
So you raised a really important question, Mr. Jefferson, because, and a point, because here's the thing, our children are watching us. We all know that, right? And the things that we think they don't see, they know when we're in distress. They can't usually sometimes verbalize what they're seeing, but they can feel it. And so we would do ourselves, more good if we were to sort of focus first on our own healing practices. Even as a therapist, I remind people that, I have to talk to people too. I mean, these things are heavy. And if we don't model for our children our willingness to be brave and to enter brave spaces, then it's going to be even harder for them. But here's the thing, our children also can lead the way. And we can learn a lot by observing them in their candor and by creating a culture of caring around them and a culture of transparency that allows them to come forward. But I agree that, the first step is, doing some internal work. Often when I'm doing professional development training with teachers in schools, I mean, they want me to come in and work with the children, and I say, well, I got to start with you because this is something that needs to happen here first. And again, recognizing, of course, these are difficult conversations, right? But Kwame Appiah, reminds us that future generations will ultimately condemn us if we don't do it, right? Like, and it's one of the things that I know for sure that future generations will wonder about is like, where were we when they were when they were suffering? You know, if they could, you know, face these things, really adult-like challenges with head on, why couldn't we? Right. So we owe it to them to push through even our difficult emotional spaces, to rise up, to meet them, so that they can feel protected and supported. So I agree 1,000% that the work has to happen first with us as adults, and then in parallel and in tandem with what the work that we were doing to support our children.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have time for one final question before we need to let Dr. Powell go. Anyone else?
I know that you have to establish a safe environment. We do a great job of establishing a safe environment. We do a great job of building relationship, but we're still working with minority young boys who have difficulty verbalizing. What strategies do you use to kind of best help students verbalize what's going on in them and become more willing to ask for help?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and it gave me a great opportunity to lift up the fact that I have, you know, been a partner with DNS, you know, for a while, and I've observed the loving, caring community that you have created for these boys, and it is one of the reasons why whenever you call, I'm coming, because I believe so strongly in the mission. And also, I've been so inspired by the staff, the supporters, the investors, their commitment to this cause. So I just want to say, even as we are talking about some of the challenges, you are setting an example for what is possible when people lock arms and decide that they're going to intervene on behalf of our children. So as I noted before, I think we have to, when I was working with DNS, we started with Dr. Vanel, who allowed me, I approached him, you know, sort of on a cold call, like, I want to come and, you know, support, and he opened the door, and I haven't walked out of it since. I think we started a male hoods club as part of the Friday clubs, and we allowed boys, we created all these kinds of opportunities for them to express themselves. We did, you know, sort of reading music videos, you know, how do you do a biopsy on a video and understand it and talk about it? And we had them do art projects, like getting out of the box, like how do you talk about your, you know, there are so many like little tools like that I'm happy to share that we've found successful. And we've learned a lot about, from our boys, about the high level of acuity and intelligence. You know, my team at UNC would say, oh, we come tired because it's Friday and it's been a long week, but we leave inspired. And I think that that's an important thing to recognize, that our boys are capable of doing this, and they are critically aware of most of what we're talking about, and just want us to like own up and say, okay, this is what's happening. Let's talk. Let's have a real conversation. So I think creating those discursive spaces where they can be, exist, heal, grow, and thrive, and be in community with each other is by far one of the most important interventions we can provide.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone so much for being with us. Thank you, Dr. Powell. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Powell is in very high demand all over the country and beyond, and we appreciate her taking time out of her day to come and spend with us, and we appreciate the love and the care that she holds for Durham Nativity School, still even living in Connecticut, how much she cares about us and the school and our community of young men. So thank you, Dr. Powell, again for being with us.
Yes, God bless everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Guys, so quick announcement. You'll be the first to hear that the spring event is going to be virtual. And that will take, we just picked a date, that is Thursday, September the, and I'm going to say the wrong date now, September the 3rd. And so look for more information to come on that. And we're going to try to make it as fun and as exciting as the usual event is. And there'll be lots of fun surprises. But know that based on what's happening, we are looking to move to that format. So look for information to come. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We appreciate your support of everything that we do. And we hope that you have a great weekend. Thank you.